Wonderful. Thanks very much, Jane. And just as people join us, if we can just remember when you are not speaking, if you can just keep on mute, and that'll just help keep the background noise to a minimum. So it's really great to be with you all here today. My name is Alastair Davis. My pronouns are he, him, and as well as chairing the Scottish Government's group that's relating to social enterprise, equality and diversity, I'm also the Chief Executive of Social Investment Scotland. But we'll talk a little bit more about the work of that Scottish Government group in just a second. I'm really pleased that today I'm joined by three particular experts in the field of equality, diversity and inclusion. And I want to ask each of them just to introduce themselves briefly, first of all, and then we'll talk a bit more about what we're planning to do across the session today. So if I can start first of all with Bayile.
Good afternoon, I'm Bayile Adeoti. I'm the founder of Dechomai, a social enterprise that stimulates entrepreneurship within ethnic minority communities, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you so much. And then David Cameron.
We were all muted. Hi guys, I'm David Cameron. I'm the CEO of the Scottish Union of Support and Employment. I've been with the organisation for about 5 years, and prior to that I worked in this employability sector within a large national provider for 20 years. It's nice to join you all today.
Thanks, David. And then finally, Ellis.
Thanks, Alastair. Hi, I'm Ellis Beardsmore. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Chief Exec and co-founder of Pride Outside. And we're an LGBT social enterprise creating a world where all LGBTQ+ people are safe and well.
Great, thanks, Ellis. And we'll get to hear a little bit more about each of these people and the organisations that they run and their interaction with this area a little bit later in the session. I'm really grateful that Social Enterprise Scotland have shown real leadership here in organising the first of these sessions, and it's really great to be participating in the first of them to provide an introduction into what I know is an area that everybody is really interested in, but everybody has different levels of knowledge and awareness, and that means that we can often struggle to know what to do is for the best. And certainly my hope alongside Social Enterprise Scotland is that you'll leave the session today at least a little bit better informed and perhaps a little bit curious about what you might want to do to go away and find out more information about what you might do within your own social enterprise, or where you might go to find out more about anything that you've heard today. So just to explain a little bit more about why I am here hosting this session, as many of you will be aware, in Scotland, we're really fortunate to have huge support from the Scottish Government for social enterprise in Scotland. And the main way in which that support is demonstrated is via a 10-year strategy for social enterprise in Scotland. And I think we're actually now beyond the midway point of that 10-year strategy. And alongside that strategy, there have been a series of action plans, of which we're currently in the second action plan. And what the Scottish Government do is, alongside each of those action plans, pull together a reference group, which includes representation from across the social enterprise sector that it can use as a sounding board and an area to reflect on progress made, and actually really to hold everybody accountable for the progress that's being made in relation to that action plan. Now, this year, there are a lot of actions that are contained within that action plan. You can't do everything all at once. And the group working with the Scottish Government officials have identified a number of specific issues where we really wanted to see a bit more progress being made. And alongside issues like net zero and how social enterprises measure their impact, another area that was identified for specific focus was equality, diversity and inclusion. And there are different people from across the social enterprise space that the Scottish Government asked to chair working groups to look at those issues in more detail. Now, I am a gay man, and I was asked to take on the chairing of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. And it has been a real privilege to do so. And I just want to say a couple of things about how that group has gone about its work in the early stages. The first thing is that the action that was identified within the action plan specifically related to the diversity of boards within social enterprises. And really the reference group felt that that interpretation of equality and diversity was too narrow for a first step in looking at EDI in social enterprise in Scotland. So with the agreement of Scottish Government, we widened that out to think about initially looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in all its forms, rather than specifically thinking about board membership. And that's not to undermine the importance of having a diverse board. Of course, it's important that social enterprises have boards that bring lived experience and represent the communities that they're working with. But they also have to think about equality, diversity, and inclusion all the way through the organisation. So that's one thing that we've worked on to change. And the second thing is there are various different members that have been approached to form part of that group. And those members are not representing any particular communities. They're there as individuals. So I'm not there to represent the LGBTQ community. I wouldn't ever profess to being able to do that. I'm there as myself and bringing my own lived experience to the group, particularly being a gay leader of a social enterprise. And I think those things are important to understand, first of all. We're working closely with the Scottish Government about what will come next. We've finished an initial cycle of review and reflection and thinking about, we've looked at different parts of the social enterprise world. And we're thinking about what might come next. And one thing that Jane and I would encourage you to do today to help us with that work and to inform the Scottish Government about what comes next is just through the session. If there are things that come up that you think, I'd like to know more about that, or I'd like the Scottish Government to do more on that, you can just pop that in the chat and then we can feed that back, not only to the group that I work with, but also to the Scottish Government officials. The one thing that I would say that we've picked up through the work of that group so far is that undoubtedly everybody that's involved in social enterprise in Scotland wants to do more when it comes to equality, diversity and inclusion. There's a real appetite to do more. But what we've also picked up is that there's also a real nervousness about what to do first. And in the case of whatever it is, whatever actions you might take, that you get something wrong. And actually that's a really honest and open position to come at this from. And actually what we want to do through this work and other interventions is give people the comfort and the confidence to take action and to do that in the confidence that actually that action will be positive and well received. But we know that you're going to make mistakes and you will make mistakes, and that's why it's important that we're establishing today's session as a safe space for you to ask questions that you might not feel comfortable asking elsewhere. But what I would ask through that is that we all try to be respectful to each other, and particularly to those people who have joined on the panel today, who are giving up their own time to share their own experience of equality, diversity, inclusion in social enterprise. So again, throughout the session, and we want to allow time for questions towards the end. If there are questions that you would like to ask either of me or any of the speakers, then please just pop them into the chat, and Jane's going to help me coordinate them when we get to that point in the agenda. So the first thing that I would like to explore in a little bit more detail is the issue of language. And I think this is particularly where people can feel nervous. And we can often feel nervous about saying the wrong thing, calling somebody the wrong name, identifying a group by something that might be inappropriate. And I think that's perhaps where a lot of this nervousness comes from about taking action. So I wanted to get this out onto the table straight away. We're joined by experts, and really in turn, I just want to give each particular group of experts the opportunity to think about the language that they use within their own communities, so we can make sure that we can treat everybody with the respect that they deserve. So if I can turn first of all to you, Bayile, in terms of the work that you do with people of colour. How should we talk about the people that the groups that you work with in a respectful way that they would recognise?
Thank you, Alastair. Yes, using the term people of colour is a great one. Over the past few years, I guess up until the unfortunate events of George Floyd, BAME was the term that was used a lot. and it was used to encapsulate every minority. But what we found over the past few years is when you're using the term BAME, it doesn't really cover a certain group of minorities. And what we're finding more, especially like with ourselves, we like to differentiate. So we'll say a lot that we work with like lots of Black communities, and that way it helps identify that community or other minority ethnic groups. That's another thing that you could always use. Minoritized groups is another good terminology, but sometimes it doesn't refer to people of color. So yeah, just identifying Black, ethnic minorities, and even if you want to identify the region. So even when we work with different communities, sometimes we might say we're working with a group of Arabic women or North African women. So identifying that geographic region. And also when you're working with people, asking them specifically, how would you like to be known as when we're working with you?
Great, thank you. And I think that's important because I know in conversation with family members, or there's sometimes an anxiety about referring to people as being Black. There's been a perception in the past that that might not be appropriate, but from your point of view, it's entirely appropriate for you to be referred to as a Black woman or a woman of colour.
Yes, and I guess over the next few months in Scotland, you will see more Black organisations coming forward, wanting their voices heard, because under that BAME umbrella, the Black communities are feeling that they've not been heard and their voices or their opinions have been encapsulated with other minority groups who are maybe receiving more support. So you will see more groups identifying and saying that they are Black or Black-led organisations.
Great, thank you for that. That's really useful. David, if I could come to you next in terms of thinking about people with disabilities, what's your guidance for the language that we should use to refer to these particular groups?
Well, my first point, I'll just pick up on the kind of final point that Bayile made, which is the best thing to do is always to ask people. And one of the kind of pieces of work that we've been doing, particularly with a project that we're running, a public social partnership, is talking to employers about what we're calling difficult workplace conversations. Now, the word difficult is difficult actually because it somehow implies that people are difficult, but it's not the people who are difficult. It's that people don't like to have conversations. And the reality, of course, is that every individual person has their own particular support needs, the things that are going to enable them to do their job effectively. And that's no different if you're a disabled person. The terminology that's usually used would be disabled person rather than people with disabilities. I'm not, I'll be honest, a fundamentalist about that, you know, but people quite often do prefer disabled people nowadays. It's more in fitting with the social model of disability, which the Scottish Government have endorsed. I would say endorsed, but not necessarily carried through in all the different ways it should be carried through if you're looking at health and education and things like that, but it is the position that they take. Where it does become slightly more difficult is, for example, you wouldn't necessarily say learning disabled people, you'd probably say people with learning disabilities, which is why it's important to ask people. You might say autistic people or, you know, and neurodiverse people. One of the real challenges is, and I've worked in this sector many years, is that many people do not wish to be labelled at all. I remember back in the day running ESF projects and having to report on what we had done and being asked for evidence about the client group that we supported. And we didn't want to ask people with learning disabilities to tick a box saying, I've got a learning disability. It's not the way those people chose to describe themselves. So it can be quite challenging at times. But I would say disabled people, people with learning disabilities, if that's appropriate, people who have experienced sensory loss or sensory impairment. Impairment always seems to be not a great word, but that is the word that people do choose to use. And yep, the key to it is always ask people first and foremost if it's possible to do so in a respectful way.
Great, thanks for that, David. And Ellis, if I could turn to you now just for your own thoughts on this particular topic of language.
Yeah, thanks, Alastair. So I think for the LGBT community, there are a couple of things. So partly just not assuming people's gender or their sexuality. And we live in a world that's really gendered, or in a world that kind of often assumes heterosexuality. So it's just checking in on that when we talk about people. So for example, when I got married, lots of people might say to me, or particularly they said it to my wife actually more, they said, oh, who's the lucky man? Right. And actually she was marrying me. I'm a non-binary trans person. So just saying, oh, who's the lucky person doesn't take away from that, you know, it doesn't take away from who that person is to you, but it also doesn't then alienate them, because sometimes she would just be like, oh yeah, they're nice, because she didn't want to have that conversation every time. So yeah, just thinking about where, or, you know, or if we talk about boys and girls, can we talk about children? Ladies and gentlemen, people gathered here today, how can we just take those assumptions of gender and sexuality away from what we do? And then I wanted to just talk briefly about pronouns, because I know I really heard what Alastair was saying at the beginning, and we see this a lot in Pride Outside. We do lots of diversity training. People are really scared to get it wrong. And I think pronouns can be one of that areas where people find it difficult. It can be a bit confusing. There can be this real fear of getting it wrong. So I just kind of wanted to break it down a little bit. So pronouns are the language that we use to talk about ourselves or other people instead of using their name. So we might say, Alastair, he said this earlier, for example. And so the most common pronouns are, yeah, she, her, and he, him. But so, for example, I use they, them pronouns. That's because I identify as non-binary and as a trans person. And so I don't identify as male or female. And so both he, him, and she, her don't feel right to me. So that's why I use they, them. And I think the key thing here is just checking in with people. What are their pronouns? What do they use? And then practicing it. And one of the things that I've found really helpful for people in using they, them pronouns is noticing where we gender things. So we might see a dog and we might say, he's doing this, but we might not know what the gender of that dog is. So actually using they, them when we talk about dogs or trees or inanimate objects can just help us get used to that language. And yeah, I think pronouns are really important. It can feel like a really small thing. It's just the word we use to describe people. But actually, if you can imagine somebody using the wrong pronoun for you, people probably use your pronouns 50 to 100 times a day, and somebody getting that wrong 80 or 90% of the time, that then feels really difficult and really uncomfortable. And I think one of the stats that I find really helpful, and I don't want to bombard you with stats, is that there was some research done in the Journal of Adolescent Health. And for young people, there was a 29% decrease, so almost a 30% decrease in suicidal thoughts when young people experience their name or gender or correct gender being used in just one part of their lives. So it doesn't have to be everywhere that people get it right, but a 30% reduction in suicidal thoughts when we get it right in one place. So that's why, part of the reason why it's so important. Alastair, have I got like 2 more minutes? Sorry, I feel like I've spoken a lot.
No, that's fine. And I know you're going to cover that a little bit more when you speak in more detail about the work of Pride Outside. But I think it's really useful. And I think that all of us that work in social enterprise in Scotland want social enterprise in Scotland to be an open and a welcoming community, because the only way we're going to increase the activity and the impact and the profile of social enterprises in Scotland is if it's an open and welcoming community. And that means welcoming in everybody into our spaces, into our social enterprise networks, into our events, into our programmes, into our funding programmes. And I think it's just basic courtesy, actually, to make sure that we're treating people with respect when they come into those spaces, and having a basic level of knowledge about how people want to be referred to, or the language that we use. So that's why I wanted to talk about that particular issue, first of all, before we got into the detail of the session. So thank you for my experts. Each of the speakers that we have today represent a different aspect of equality, diversity and inclusion. We don't cover it all. We would be here for many, many events if we wanted to go into every bit of detail related to that. But what we wanted to do with the experts that we have with us today is give each of them the opportunity to talk in particular about their work and the particular issues that they see and how their work is helping to overcome those issues. So we're going to go around the speakers again in the same order, but just allowing each of them the opportunity to take a little bit longer to explain more about their work. If you do have questions, please just pop them into the chat and we'll take a note of them and come back to them towards the end. Okay, so if I could just pass over to Bayile first of all and give the floor to you for the next 5-10 minutes or so.
Thank you, Alastair. As I said, Dechomai, we support ethnic minority communities and we stimulate entrepreneurship within those communities, particularly focusing on Black communities. What we found in Scotland and like the whole of the United Kingdom is there is a disparity within communities and different communities when it comes to entrepreneurship and enterprise and different support. Something that I think with yourselves, if you are working with ethnic minorities, to identify is they do face further barriers in comparison to other communities, and to also know that different communities will face more barriers than others. So different ethnic minority groups face more barriers than other communities in Scotland. And in England, it kind of flips on its head where other communities face more barriers in comparison to Scotland. So I think having that knowledge and understanding of the different barriers that ethnic minority groups face, and even then within those groups, what further barriers do they face? So what we tend to find is lots of the people that we support will say that the support that they have found maybe wasn't specifically catered to them. So with all the support that we deliver to different minority groups, we tend to look. So for example, I'll use example, we were working with women, they came from Sudan, Bangladesh, and Algeria and Liberia, and they all, we said, well, you're North African apart from Bangladesh, and we said it was a group of Arabic women, that was a group, the common denominator. And then we also looked to see, well, what do these women have in common? So at the time we were working with them, it fell during Ramadan, so identifying the things that would be able to make the program work for them, and also having the discussions as we were tailoring the program to them, we were making sure that we included them in everything that that we were trying to develop and trying to create for them to make sure that the experience was worthwhile and one that they enjoyed. So taking into consideration things like Ramadan, taking consideration the things that wouldn't make them feel comfortable. So they wanted to have their hijabs off, which meant that men weren't allowed in without prior notice. Those women say, we are going to have a man come to deliver this certain workshop, if that's okay with you. And then also knowing that as we are helping them, they're also aware of the language and the ecosystem. Even though, like myself, I came to Scotland for high school. So I would say I identify as Scottish, I'm Black and Scottish, but I guess the language and the terminology sometimes in the ecosystem still makes me think, gosh, do I speak a different language? Like, am I not understanding this? And we tend to find that with the people that we support is having them understand even just how to work with funders, communicating with funders, and just different specifics on what the expectations of the ecosystem is. Questions that we do get asked specifically are, is there no funding particularly created by, say, for example, Black and ethnic minority funders that would support us in reaching the communities that we want to reach or the people that we want to support? Some of the funding that is out there, yes, it might be for minorities, but what we're hearing with other community groups is the funding has been developed by other people specifically for ethnic minorities without consultation from minority groups, to actually ask them what is needed in the community. So, for example, during COVID, there was lots of funding available for support for food banks and different things, but in minority communities, tinned food isn't something that they're used to. So tinned tomatoes is fine, but not tinned beans or pastas and different things. We asked a woman several times, and what she was looking for was, yes, more fresh food, fresh vegetables. And that's where ourselves and other groups came together, and we spoke to funders and said, we're actually going to create vouchers. We're going to speak to minority food shops. And what we're going to do is distribute vouchers, giving someone the dignity to go in to buy their own shop, but also buying food that they can identify with and food that their whole family can enjoy. So that's something that's worked. And even now with the cost of living crisis, we're seeing more and more funders now accepting the fact that, yeah, you can distribute vouchers for specific minority shops, that people can get access to food with the dignity that they want. We are seeing that, and you're probably seeing with the census, that 3% of minorities are running social enterprises. Ourselves, we ran a Black Social Entrepreneurs programme. We struggled to find Black social entrepreneurs in the length and breadth of Scotland, and many organisations will say they struggle to find social entrepreneurs as a whole. So once again, it is the language of social entrepreneurship. What is social entrepreneurship, and how can we reach more people? More people are doing informal support in their communities, but we're also trying to make sure that everyone is aware of what a social enterprise is, how they can become a social enterprise, and how they can continue to support social entrepreneurs in their community. I think I've used up my time. Alastair?
No, that's perfect. Just if I could just ask one question around about decision making and representation amongst decision making. You referenced how people of colour were saying to you that, you know, who's involved in making this. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is to have diverse voices involved in making decision making, particularly when it's about funding and support for marginalised groups and people of colour?
I think it's important for the whole ecosystem to have a look, and it's something that we look at too, is even for our applications, is it something that a 5-year-old could understand or a 10-year-old? But when it comes to funding or access to funding, it's important that you do have other people consult for you on that funding application. Is it something that's accessible? Is it something that's easy for people to apply to? And quite a lot of the barriers that we're seeing for people applying for funding is they look at an application and they don't want to apply for it because it's intimidating. And when I look at for them, I find it intimidating too. So having somebody or lots of representatives that would be able to say, actually, we've had a look at this. Can you simplify it? Can you let them put videos? Can you let them put testimonies of the work that they've actually done, testimonials? Because it is hard to articulate everything on paper, but maybe videos or pictures can help articulate that. And not also be aware of the different organisations that do exist, especially if you are a funder. What other organisations can you use? So what we find, and I've said this to Alice a few times, is if Dechomai doesn't get called to help support something, then it's another organisation called Radiant and Brighter that gets asked. And it tends to be like one or the other. And something that Fiona Matova and I always say is, why can't we both be at the table? Why does it have to be one or the other? Because now you're actually creating competition. Or if you've got two Black-led organisations, then can you also have a Chinese-led organisation, an Asian-led organisation to also consult with you to make sure that everything that's there is appropriate for the different communities. And you'll start seeing that maybe there are some things that might be suitable for a Black-led organisation, but not suitable for Asian-led organisations. And that's where consultation and conversations like this are really appropriate. But I think the other thing about, if we talk about growth in Scotland, Alastair, when it comes to funding and access to funding, I know, having spoken to other funders, that many Black-led organisations probably don't get into the investment stage. And if we use an organisation like First Pot, for example, they tend to just access like the 25,000 funding, and that's where the ceiling is for them. So if we want to make the ecosystem more inclusive, then we need to see what barriers are there. Why are these organisations not growing to their potential? Especially, I mean, if we look at ethnic minority businesses, they account for 19% of all business in Scotland, of which 3% are ethnic minority social enterprises. But why are they not growing to the rates of their other ethnic counterparts?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting thinking about ecosystems, and you and I have spoken about that before, and I think it's probably fair to say that in the past we've perhaps fallen into a trap of thinking about, oh, we've dealt with that because we've ticked the box, because we've invited a certain organisation to the table, so that's that dealt with. But you would never say that with a white-led organisation. We've dealt with that because it's a white-led organisation. So if you flip that on its head, you can understand why there is a real issue here in building that diverse ecosystem of people with a range of different voices, even within a particular group. So I think that's something really important to think about when we speak about our social enterprise ecosystem in Scotland, which, yes, is strong in many ways, but is it as strong and diverse as it could be by bringing in as many different voices as possible? Thanks very much. I'm sure there'll be questions coming out of that later in the session. David, if I could turn to you now in terms of thinking about disabled people and the work that you do, if you wanted just to share a bit more about your work.
Well, the main issue concerning disabled people is what is called the disability employment gap. And if you've not heard of it, the disability employment gap is basically, the numbers vary, depending what's happening in the economy, and obviously we've gone through a period of economic turbulence. But in the region of maybe 45 to 50% of disabled people will be in work, people of working age. For the wide population, it's about 80%, and that difference is the disability employment gap. And it's becoming of great interest to policymakers, particularly after COVID. You'll have seen reports, there was a thing in the newspapers this morning about the fact that now across the UK, 5.2 to 5.3 million people of working age who are not working, and then a variety of different types of benefits. This as well, employment is allegedly a record low, which of course it isn't. So that's really not true. So the disability employment gap is a kind of big focus of our work. We work with providers across Scotland who are mainly focused on employability and supported employment, and working with different client groups, diverse client groups. Some of those will be third sector, some of them will be local authorities. Supporting people into work, and SUSE's role kind of within that is lobbying, campaigning, training, events. We're a membership organisation, and we've got a big conference happening next Tuesday at Murrayfield for 250 people, and I'm not stressed about it at all, let me tell you. So the reason why we have a disability employment gap is because we have indirect and direct discrimination that happens that affects disabled people. So one of the things we do, for example, through the PSP project that we run, is to work with employers to look at how their recruitment, how they're attracting people, how they're retaining people. The Public Social Partnership is a partnership of about 40 organisations, providers across Scotland, who came together. We are the lead partner, funded by the government. And basically, the role of a PSP, if you're not familiar with it, is to pilot a new approach to something. So what typically happens in our sector, as you guys will be fully familiar with, is that you get a kind of top-down approach to service design. The government, the local authority decide what they want, and then they go out and say, who's going to do this for us? And a PSP is supposed to be different. It's supposed to be more bottom-up, in which you put out some money, you pilot some ideas, you find out what works, and ultimately you have the potential to go back to the commissioners, the people who hold the money, to say, this has been proven to work, this is the kind of thing you should commission. PSPs, incidentally, do not have a fabulous track record of ultimately leading through to commission services, but they have done a lot of interesting work around about, for example, the closure of day centres for disabled people, or work in terms of people leaving prison and things like that. And they have demonstrated a lot of success, if only the money was there afterwards. So our PSP is focused on working with employers, and it's really about the demand side of the disability employment gap. And I always muddle up my supply and my demand, so I'll try and explain it as best I can. The Scottish Government have set themselves an ambition of having the disability employment gap by 2038. But in reality, what that means is tens of thousands, perhaps 150 or 200,000 people in Scotland who are disabled or who have a long-term health condition would have to move into work in order to make that a reality. Now, with the best will in the world, there is no way that is happening through government-funded programmes, because that would cost tens of billions of pounds. And indeed, it doesn't need to happen through government-funded programmes. What we need to see is for the demand side of the economy to change how it operates, so that employers are doing things differently. They're knocking down the barriers that are preventing disabled people getting jobs, so that people who are, you know, well able to get themselves into work do so. And we all know that, you know, you could be people that are very well educated, you might have mobility issues, you might use a wheelchair, for example, you might be a person with a sensory impairment. There's absolutely no reason why you can't work with the proper adjustments in place. So the PSP really focuses on that. The idea being that if we can change the culture in Scotland's workplaces, we will ultimately see more disabled people moving into employment under their own steam, or perhaps with one or two small interventions. And when we think about the limited resources that government have got left to them, that obviously can be devoted to those people who maybe need longer term and more intensive support from services or indeed social enterprises. So that's the kind of work that we're kind of engaged in at the moment, and that's the, you know, the real challenge. A very interesting piece of work, I have to tell you. Holding together a partnership with 40 organisations is great fun. It has generally been really, really interesting, not without its challenges. But the PSP has set itself an ambition, and that over time, over the next couple of years, we want to establish a centre of excellence for Scotland, which will basically be a social enterprise where hopefully a group of organisations have come together to form this. People with lived experience will be at the heart of it, and are already indeed at the heart of the PSP in terms of designing interventions, delivering services for employers, delivering training, governance and management. That's all going to be very key to how the Centre of Excellence operates. And the idea will be, we'll have this enterprise, organisations will come together, we'll bring employers to us who are interested in diversifying and being more inclusive and being fairer in their approaches. And the Centre of Excellence will offer those employers a wide range of different services that offer practical solutions that are proven to work, to make sure that they're going about attract, recruit and retain in a fundamentally different kind of way. And it will be a commercial enterprise, so we envisage that we'll probably need some grant funding, some sponsorship, but we will look to generate part of that income through sales. There's a very important point in there that a lot of the businesses and companies we're going to be working with obviously will be private sector. So why should the taxpayer pay for private sector to do what they should be doing? So those guys need to be looking at freeing up a bit of resource to work with organisations. And basically the Centre of Excellence will be a kind of marketplace of experts where employers will be able to come buy those services, and we're thinking over time potentially get accreditation and be long-term partners with us. I'm going to finish up. I'm going to do a wee check. I'm going to do a wee test here, okay? Discrimination takes many forms, indirect and direct discrimination, and quite often we find that there is indirect discrimination. People are doing stuff and they don't even know they're doing it, right? So I can't see everybody on my screen, but from the people I can see, can I ask you, if you use some form of digital recruitment platform when you're recruiting people for jobs, can you raise your hand? Now that would include the big guys, you know, like S1 jobs and things like that, or if you have some kind of system that you use, could you raise your hand if you use some form of digital recruitment platform? Okay. Now I'm not going to ask anybody to keep their hands raised or any of the rest of it. You can put your hands down now. But I'm going to ask you a question. Have you tested that digital recruitment platform by having disabled people apply for a job using it and finding out their experiences? Because the reality is most employers haven't. So one of the things we do within the PSP is we offer a digital recruitment review for employers. And we have a group of people, disabled people, with various different disabilities. There'll be people who are blind, people who are deaf, people who have physical disability, people with learning disabilities. And they apply for real jobs with an employer. And we observe them, and this is carried out by our kind of expert web developers that we work with. We observe them through the test and we find out how accessible that recruitment platform is for employers. And we've done this with big high street chains and hotel and leisure companies and local authorities and all the rest of it. And then we provide a detailed report for that employer and talk to them about how they need to change what they're doing. And the reality is that in something like, we did a test lately, and in about 30% of cases, people could not complete the application form using the online system because there was all kinds of barriers put in their way. And there were in the region of 50% of people who said, I would never apply for that to that employer again. So that's telling you that's a form of indirect discrimination. Nobody's doing it deliberately. They just haven't thought about it. And so what they need is a bit of education, a bit of input to help them do a bit better. And our experience is that employers do want to do better. Sorry, I've probably gone well over my time.
No, that's fine, David. And I think that's already a top tip coming out of the session so far that we can all go away and explore. If I could just maybe ask you a question before we move on to Ellis. Obviously, the way in which we're all working now has shifted dramatically since the pandemic. But how has that impacted upon people with disabilities positively and or negatively in terms of accessing the workplace?
It's a mixed picture, as actually is for all of us, isn't it? Now, there's many people that are happy that obviously, if you're someone for whom getting to the office or the workspace is a challenge, being able to work from your home office is absolutely ideal. There's many people who maybe don't want to be in crowded environments, they can't concentrate, they can't focus. So there's many people for whom that does work, and it's maybe actually opening up different opportunities for some people in different sectors. There is another side to it, however. Now, we're engaged in supported employment, obviously, with the Scottish Union of Supported Employment. One of the key things about supported employment is on-site job coaching and mentoring, and actually training someone to do a job in the real workplace, breaking down a task and taking them through a process to learn the task. The reality is we have all done that. We just didn't realise we did it. We have all entered workplaces and we've been supported or mentored or trained informally by people. And the reality for some people is that if you aren't able to go and do that, or it doesn't work in the same way, you don't learn in the way that you might have been able to do in the past. I'm all in favour of working from home. We worked from home before the pandemic by and large, but it's actually, when you think about it, it's not only disabled people or other groups that might be affected. You think about young workers entering a workplace who in the past would have been working alongside people who are more experienced, that observe things, that pick up cues, that just find out how things work and how things are done and how to do your job well. And if those people are now actually not getting as much access to that workplace time alongside other people, they're also affected. So it's quite a similar thing as well, and it might take longer for people to learn their job properly.
Thanks, David. So positives and negatives, as I'm sure we've all experienced. Ellis, last but not least, tell us more about Pride Outside.
Thanks, Alastair. So yeah, as I said at the beginning.
To me? What, we're finished?
Yes, thanks, David. Don't go anywhere though. I'm sure there'll be questions for you later.
Sorry.
Ellis.
Okay, sorry.
Cool. Sorry. Yeah, so as I said earlier, Pride Outside, we are creating a world where LGBTQ plus people are safe and well. And I guess what that means is that LGBTQ plus people's experiences of the world at the moment isn't safe, and people aren't always well. And so I kind of want to just dive into a little bits of those. So firstly, just to talk about more broadly about the LGBT people population's experience. So there was a health needs assessment done for the LGBT population that looked at physical and mental health indicators. And in all categories, LGBTQ plus people scored worse than non-LGBTQ plus people. And there, I was in a meeting the other day with someone from Health Improvement Scotland who called it a public health crisis hiding in plain sight. And I think that's really important because for me, it's really important to understand this when we talk about social enterprise and what's happening. So yeah, up to 60% of LGBT people that they surveyed in this assessment have been discriminated against in the last year, and including quite a lot of that being in a workplace environment. 1 in 3 people had attempted suicide. But also, I think what's interesting as well as we think about social enterprise and working is that 20% of the LGBT population were food insecure, as opposed to 12% of the general population. And this stat really, in some ways, it doesn't surprise me from the experiences I have from the work we do, but it also really surprised me. So if we're talking about LGBT people being able to work in social enterprises, we need to understand some of those barriers to entry. And those are around mental health, they're around a lack of resources, they're around discrimination. And I think I really resonated with what both David and Bayile said about language, around people not understanding people's experiences, or applying for jobs in a different way, right? I've gone to apply for jobs or for funding, and then there's been no box to tick for my gender. So I'm like, well, actually, I'm not going to apply for funding with you, or I'm not going to choose to work for you because already you're telling me that this isn't a safe place for me to be in. And then I think the bit that comes from that feels a bit, in some ways feels a bit challenging to say, is that the social enterprise space is a microcosm of what's happening in the world. And I think to some extent, both Bayile and David have spoken about this, right? The discrimination that people of colour or disabled people or LGBT people experience in the world at large also happens in this space. And yes, we're all trying to do better, and there's a big fear of getting it wrong. And it's important to know that that happens, because I think what that means is that people don't feel safe, so they don't always stay in the space. So we're quite a new social enterprise. I run Pride Outside with my wife, Lou, and we've been going formally for about 18 months, informally for about 6 years. And we have both had experiences in that startup space where we're not in our late 30s, early 40s, where we're not trained to be a therapist and a coach. Had we not got lots of resilience and experience in the workplace, we would have left and never come back. And I think that for me is really, really important, this concept of being safe and feeling safe. And it's similar to what both Bayile and David have spoken about in different contexts. And I think, and again, just to name it really specifically, I think transphobia is really difficult at the moment. We've seen it with, the Section 35 from the Scottish Government and the big debates that have come out around that. And what that means for me as a trans social entrepreneur who wants to build our platform and share the work we're doing, I feel genuinely scared for my safety. And I don't feel like there are other people in social enterprise spaces that are there to have that conversation, because people say, oh, it's not that bad, really, is it? You can get married, it's all okay now. And I realize that maybe I'm bringing a bit of a stark message, but I think it's really important to understand I have a genuine risk and a genuine fear for mine and my wife's safety, the work that we do, and the work for the people that we work with. And so to kind of end on a slightly more, let's take you through the journey. So at Pride Outside, we do two things. So one is about diversity and inclusion training. And this came because our space got vandalized with homophobic and racist graffiti. So we were taking a group out into the woodlands to improve their well-being, and then there was this racist and homophobic graffiti, and we were like, actually, we need to be tackling both sides of this. So it's great to do the outdoor well-being work that we do, that's our core, but that's not changing the system that people are in. And so this is where our LGBT diversity and inclusion work comes from. And we do training for organisations and for individuals. We've got e-learning, we've got face-to-face learning. And I wanted to give an example, a positive example. We did some training. There was someone on the list from the Prince's Trust, but we did some training with the Prince's Trust recently. We were talking about gender and about pronouns and about name changes, a bit like I talked about earlier. And the Prince's Trust have a great scheme where they have money to support the young people they work with to get documents. So to get a passport or a driving license. And these youth workers said, we don't know what to do because these young people are changing their names, but they don't know how to do it legally. And we don't want to get them a driving license in the wrong name, because actually that's really difficult and really damaging. So we talked them through it as part of our training, like how does that process happen? And then we got an email in the afternoon from one of the youth workers being like, oh my gosh, I've just had the most amazing conversation with a trans young person who didn't know how to do this, who didn't know this was possible. And so I think that for me is one of those examples of actually in the social enterprise space, we are working with LGBT people all the time. And that knowledge and that permission to get it wrong that we give in our training is really important so that we can learn that and do that better. And that we need to think about that more broadly in the social enterprise ecosystem. And how are we, as Bayile talks about in terms of Black social enterprises, how are we bringing up and nourishing LGBT social enterprises there is a huge network of informal support that happens because people are often distanced from friends or family. Huge, that all happens. How are we bringing that into the social enterprise space and valuing that as valid work? And then just finally, just to say our wellbeing work, we do outdoor wellbeing work in the woodlands, and we also run a Pride Outside festival on the 2nd of September, which is a beautiful, safe, sober family Pride festival. Bring your LGBT young people or come and join us if people are free. We would love to see people there.
Thanks so much, Ellis, and for being so open and honest. I know that that's not easy, but it's only through that honesty that we can learn and we can reflect on how we can make sure that social enterprise itself is as welcoming as a community as possible. So I know that myself. I'm at my best as a leader and as a chief executive when I feel safe. And I can talk about my husband, where we've just been on holiday, and knowing that I'm not going to face discrimination as a result of that. And that's really important for an LGBT person to be able to feel that they've got that safety and security. So how can we make sure that, again, our community is as open and as welcoming as possible so that every social enterprise, no matter who's running them, is run by somebody that feels safe and secure and knowing that they'll be welcomed and listened to. It's really quite special. I want to think a little bit about allyship based on what you've been talking about there, Ellis, because obviously not everybody is from a marginalised community like some of us are, but what we can have is the people that are allies. So just building on what you've just spoken about there, Ellis, there are 43 people on the call today. Talk to us a little bit about allyship and the importance of that and what that means to you.
Yeah, I think allyship is really important. We talk about this a lot. And it's also, for me, allyship is something that's really active. So it's that we've really taken those steps to think about things or to be aware of it. It's not just that kind of tick box piece. But for me, kind of 3 steps that we talk about in terms of allyship is really listen to and believe LGBT people. So really make sure that you're engaging in that, you're listening to other LGBT social enterprises, activists, but also your beneficiaries or the people that you're working with. So we're listening to people and we're really believing their experiences. We're not questioning that, we're taking that as truth. And then learn more, really taking those steps to learn more. So whether that's we've got great recommendations. For example, if you've never seen Heartstopper on Netflix, like it's a beautiful story of 2 boys falling in love at school. Yeah, I can see some hearts there. So it's that learning more, but that learning doesn't mean that we need to pick up really thick, dense textbooks on queer theory. Even as someone that loves that, I don't read all of those books. It's like, where can we get that knowledge? Where are the podcasts? And we share some of that at Pride Outside, but really taking an effort to learn more. And then finally, speaking up. I think for me, this is the most important part of allyship. It's questioning that when someone says, oh, well, I don't think it's that bad for the LGBT community, saying, oh, well, actually, let's listen to the people in the room that are talking about their experience. Or where someone says, oh, this whole gender recognition reform bill, it's all a bit, it's a bit too woke. Checking in on the trans person in the room that's probably impacted by that, but also speaking up and saying, well, actually, even if you don't know all the details, we talk about it actually in Pride Outside. We talk about calling in rather than calling out. And we find this a really helpful model. So instead of that, people don't learn, as you said at the beginning, Alastair, people don't learn when they feel shamed or embarrassed. So we do it a lot. We're like, oh yeah, I used to say that, but actually I've recently learned that this is a better phrase. And that kind of stuff. So we're not necessarily shaming people, but the phrase someone used with me recently, someone said, nobody's ever been shamed into being a vegan, right? People feel inspired into that. And so I think that speaking up is really important, but doing that in a way that takes people on that journey with us.
Great, thanks, Ellis. I'm going to think a little bit about representation. I'm going to come to Bayile. If I could just ask you, Jane, just to have a quick through the chat, see if there's any questions that I've missed, and then after we've after this next point, we'll pick up any questions from the chat and then also invite questions through raised hands. But Bayile, if I could give you a question about representation. Now, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit here but you've been quite open about this on social media. So at the weekend, you were lucky enough to be invited to the King's coronation, which is wonderful. And we're not here to talk about the coronation or the merits of the monarchy or anything like that. But one of the things that was particularly striking about the coronation service, which is obviously an ancient ritual, I mean, as a ritual and a religious service, was the representation that was part of that process. So there were people of colour involved in the service, there were female choristers involved in the choir, there were people from a whole range of different faith backgrounds that were involved in that were not involved in the past. So there was a real sense of progression in terms of representation as part of that. But for people of colour, how important is representation as part of everything that goes on within an entrepreneurial ecosystem or within social enterprise?
Alastair, like anything, representation is so important. When I received the invitation and I shared it with my friends and family, and I guess everyone expects me to be in the church beside the Abbey. So when the penny actually dropped that I was going to be in the Abbey, had many community organisations and schools that I do workshops in saying, when you're going in there, know that you're not just going in there as Bayile from Dechomai. No, you're representing X, Y, and Z. So I had like Sharpen Her, which is Sharpen Her African Women's Network. They said, you're representing us, and they've got like 200 people in their WhatsApp group. My son's school said, you're representing us, you're our ambassador. And I had so many other organisations. My Malawian cousins in Malawi saying, there's a Malawian representing us. And it felt as if like I was carrying all these organisations in my heart as us in the Abbey. But let's put the Abbey aside. What more when there's round tables and there's a Black person or a few Black people or people of colour on those tables? Everyone has a sense of there's somebody representing us, somebody representing our voice. And I think internally we need to look at ourselves as a community. Something that I shared on a podcast that's coming out in a couple of weeks is Scotland is a beautiful place. As I said, I identify as Black and Scottish, but there's still niggles in Scotland that we need to recognise. For example, the last report on ethnic minority entrepreneurship that has been specifically carried out in Scotland was in 2017. George Floyd has died. The world has seen that death, and everybody has put a black tile, or maybe you chose not to, on their grid. And whilst we talk about diversity and inclusion, we've not looked internally. Something is wrong, and we need to look underneath the bonnet to realise what is wrong in Scotland. We need to pay attention to the voices. We need to pay attention and look internally at our own organisations to see how further Black and ethnic minority organisations can be supported really well so that they thrive. Scotland is underperforming according to the gender index. Ethnic minorities aren't even on average, ethnic minority women aren't on average performing the way other ethnic minority women and organisations are in the rest of the UK. There's about an 8% difference, which shows that even then, whilst women have other barriers, ethnic minority women have further barriers to even reach parity in comparison to other minorities. Let's do something before the wheels completely collapse, before the engine completely stops. And that starts off with representation and role modelling and allyship, but it needs to be more than that. And something I just wanted to add on the allyship, Alastair, is at Dechomai, and I'm saying this for many organisations because it's been the topic over the past few weeks, and I'm now being a bit more vocal about it. We get asked to support other organisations, and it's great because we want to support other organisations, but it's also our time and our resources. And we would love to partner with as many organisations. Radiant and Brighton would love to partner and support other organisations as they're doing the EDI. Pre-Spect would love to do that too. But in order for us to do that, we also need to be compensated for our time, because it is our time that you're taking up. I've got a small team, so when you take me away for 2 hours, you're taking me away from either developing Dechomai. So please, when it comes to allyship too, compensate us for our time. But I have to also say, in addition to that, social enterprises and social enterprise organisations are really good. And I've had many saying, this is just a small token, it's £200. We actually don't do this, whilst corporates can be a bit, they'll say that they don't have a budget altogether. But when you are looking to get a speaker or even just some support, just bear that in mind too. And I'm sure Ellis and the others can vouch for that too.
Yeah. David, anything you want to come in on those points, or will I keep us moving along?
I will just make the very quick point of the fact that obviously I represent SUSE members. I don't presume to represent disabled people, but one of the things we have done and attempted to do within the PSP and other areas is to create many opportunities, and it is really important in terms of co-production. If you're talking about services for disabled people, co-production is really important, involving different people and taking on board those different experiences. And apart from anything else, it's fascinating. There's an awful lot to learn and actually to enjoy from that process.
Yeah, thanks, David. And in some ways it can be quite simple, you know, if you're putting together a panel, don't have all white men. You know, this is basic stuff. The front cover of the Social Enterprise Census Report is a picture of 2 white men.
I noticed that.
Nobody else.
That's kind of funny.
Then, as Bayile pointed out to me not that long ago, I think it's on page 40 something of that report before you see a person of colour. So this representation and role modelling and inspiration is really important if you're from an underrepresented group. Jane, are there any questions that have come up so far that we need to just pick up at this point? I will invite questions from the floor.
Asking, do the speakers think that capacity and resources are an issue for social enterprises to adopt meaningful practices? Also, along with training and awareness raising and these types of discussions, would there be any tools that would be useful, like a blueprint for organisations to adopt good practice or similar resources? And I guess kind of focusing in on governance as well in relation to all of that. So that's one. And then there was another question around if it was possible for SUSE to speak about employment opportunities for people and the PSP, but that may have come in before David kind of gave a more broader description of the work that SUSE and the PSP is doing. That's what we've got so far.
Thanks very much, Jane. If other people do have questions, I encourage you just to raise your hand just now, just so we can make sure that we've got time to accommodate them all in the time that we do have left. That would be appreciated. David, I don't know whether there's anything you want to pick up in particular about employment opportunities within the PSP, or whether you feel that you've dealt with that point in your subsequent comments.
I'll say initially that if you know of disabled people who are interested in looking becoming trainers or consultants who feel they've got something to offer, get in touch with us. We're about to go through and recruit a new cohort of people that are looking to develop that experience, and it may be people who want to add that on to an existing job. It's not necessarily, you know, and the PSP pays quite well. We're very particular about, we pay a good hourly rate for people who work with us, and it's a good kind of standard hourly rate. What I will say is, if there's general and more general interest in the PSP, we'd be perfectly happy to organise another hour for people and invite them to come along, and I can get some people from the PSP to come along and talk about it, because the PSP is always looking for more partners, or simply to spread the word, basically. I'll be happy to do that at some point in the future.
Great. I'm sure that colleagues from Social Enterprise Scotland will pick that up and perhaps look to get a further event in the diary. And in terms of that other point, David, that was raised around about resources, training and signposting, just maybe broader than thinking about your own organisation, if people want to learn more or think about what else they might do in terms of supporting people with disabilities, what would your suggestions be in terms of where they might be able to find out more or access further training and support?
It's really difficult. It is really difficult because the resources are a big question. I don't want to talk too much about my own organisation. Have a look at our website or contact us directly. And one thing I would strongly urge people to do is, obviously, as you probably will have, a good understanding and knowledge of your local area and who's operating in that local area. I can guarantee there are disabled people's organisations, there's different things happening, and there's fruitful partnerships and relationships to be developed there. Organisations that will have resources, or you can come to ourselves, and if we can't answer a question for you, we will point in the direction of other, whether it's national or local organisations that potentially can. We'd be happy to do that.
Great, thanks, David. Ellis, opportunity for a big plug here for your own social enterprise, but I know there will be other resources and places you can signpost people to.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to pick up quickly on the resources point. So we've been using this example recently and I really love it. So Virgin Airlines recently changed their clothing policy. And so they created a non-gendered clothing policy that meant anyone could wear any clothes they wanted within a framework of their uniform. And there were less strict requirements on hair and makeup. And in some ways that feels random, right? Virgin Airlines, a social enterprise space. But actually what happened was that their recruitment went up by 100%. And so for me, it's this piece that diversity and investing in diversity benefits everybody and benefits our organizations. And I think for me as well, that piece speaks to kind of, we haven't really talked very much about intersectionality, but it's all of those overlapping identities, right? You might have a gay black man who used to work for Virgin, who used to have to shave his head because Afro hair wasn't acceptable. That's changed now, and that benefits them. So I think it's really important that we are thinking about what can we do for specific communities, and we're thinking more broadly of like, what makes this a safe and welcoming place for everyone? And I think, yeah, as an organisation, we're really doing our own work on anti-racism, for example, because we know that we're two white people leading an organisation, and therefore we need to be looking at how are we engaging people of colour, how are we representing that part of our community. But then, yeah, the shameless Pride Outside plug, thanks for is that we've got a couple of different things. So we run organisational training and consultancy. And again, we will charge you for this, as Bayile said, it's really important. So we will come in and run either a 1 hour learning lunch, a half-day training session on either an introduction to the LGBT community or an introduction to gender diversity, or full-day trainings. And we can do that as a one-off, or we're working with some organisations. We've just done a big piece of consultancy for a youth organisation about how to make all of their work more trans inclusive, for example. So yeah, if you're struggling with LGBT inclusion, drop us an email. I'll put our email address in there. But we've also got have got some e-learning as well. Which I know some people can say e-learning as well, I think is really great for accessibility, gives you time to do it in your own time. It's got lots of videos, it's got lots of quizzes. It's called From LGBT Confusion to Inclusion. So if you just want to learn more about the LGBT community, I'd also really recommend that. In terms of broader learning, yeah, there are lots of people doing that. Stonewall LGBT Youth as well. I think if you're an organisation that works with young people a lot, they've got a charter programme, so you can get the LGBT charter to kind of show that you're an LGBT inclusive space. But yeah, I think it's that real committing to resources and time to that journey, because you know that in doing that you will better serve the people that your social enterprise is set up for, and it will increase your impact. Great,
thanks, Ellis. We should never apologise as social enterprises for charging people for our services. That's what we're here for, right? And it's interesting about the recruitment point. We recently had somebody who had applied for a job at Social Investment Scotland, and the reason that they had specifically applied is because of the commitments that we publicly make to EDI on our website, and they knew that as an individual, their own identity would be respected as part of that process. So it may well, this approach give you access to talent, otherwise you would have been unable to access. Bayile, just thinking about that specific point around about training and signposting and resources, and then I'm going to come to David, who's got a question.
Okay, so if for organisations, for EDI, the two amazing organisations that I would recommend to you. The first one is Prespect, and they will look into your EDI and support you with training. And the other one would be Radiant and Brighter, something that Dechomai doesn't do. So Prespect, based in Edinburgh, but they also come through to Glasgow, and they support organisations like Morgan Stanley. And then Radiant and Brighter, who are based in Glasgow. If you are a funder, Dechomai would love to support you to make your programs more inclusive and to make sure that you are reaching more ethnic minorities in everything that you do.
Thanks very much. David, you've got your hand up. Come in with your question.
Great, thanks, Alastair, and thanks to all the speakers. Really fascinating conversation. Ellis, you've kind of stole my thunder a wee bit, but I'm glad that you mentioned it. I think, you know, we all know that you know, when looking at the world of social enterprises, there always is that glass ceiling, you know, in terms of how you grow and how you get to do more and how you get to reach your full potential. But I'd like to touch on that subject of intersectionality, Ellis, that you mentioned, and actually how do we change the bigger picture here, right? So you look at the way things are commissioned. So you might get a bit of commission for you know, for poverty or for lone parents or for disability, and I think the model that David's talking about is SUSE, where there is no one person or one organisation that's an expert in every disability and every person within, you know, that has a health condition or disability. So what about, we're supporting, you know, 200 refugees just now in across Scotland, and actually, you know, what you've mentioned there, Ellis, what about, you know, that that woman that comes over maybe from Ukraine that's gender neutral, that's a lone parent, that is a black woman and has a disability or a health condition? What programme does she go on? You know, look at the wealth of experience and excellent delivery that's around the room just now, but how do you bring that together? How do you avoid that woman going from project to project to project? And how do you possibly ask her to prioritise the inequality that she's facing? You know, so that there's part of a bigger societal change here that needs to allow for more joined up delivery and more experts coming together to the betterment of people that need them. Otherwise, we're going to make nice changes, but we're never going to make changes at the scale that really makes the difference we want.
Ellis, I think that was a question for you, but I lost my sound at the end of the question, so please just carry on based on what you've heard.
Yeah, that's right. Bayile or David might want to come in. I think for me, that's where as organisations we need to be doing all of our work, right? And so like I said, as an organisation that's led by 2 white people, we know that we need to be doing our anti-racist work to make sure that our organisation is welcoming. So it's that intersection of it. And then it's looking at also, how do we specialise? What are the specific needs? And here I want to give a really big shout out actually to the work that LGBT health and wellbeing and LGBT unity are doing for asylum seekers who are also LGBT, because there is a very specific need in that population, because they don't always feel safe in broader spaces for asylum seekers and refugees. Well, they don't always feel safe to be out. And so they're, you know, actually that's a very specific service that is really needed. And part of that service is providing specific support because it's a particular navigation through the asylum system. But part of that service is also then connecting people out to either to broader LGBT services or to broader refugee and asylum services. But it's that piece of saying, okay, well, how are we joining up? How are we spending? How are we investing in that connection? And how are we working out where there are spaces where it is important that people have their own space and spaces where lots of people can come together? But yeah, it's a long-term big piece of work. I think it's not, it's not a quick fix. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in.
Bayile or David, anything else to add to that?
Just sorry, do you want to go first, Bayile?
No, you go first, David.
I was simply going to say that it is about having good and effective partners, I think, that you can call upon who bring their expertise to the table. When it gets to intersectionality, I get a bit wary because I've worked in environments where people tried to do everything and they did quite a lot of it badly. And you try to be an expert in too many subjects, and there is something to be said for expertise and experience. And of course, the people that we work with, it's really important to get it right, because everybody's had so many everybody knows so many people that have had so many bad services in their life, you know, and it's traumatizing. So yeah, I think this idea of having this kind of hinterland of partners round about you and expert advice that you can call upon, it does become more problematic when there's cost involved, definitely. It really does become more problematic, and you're asking people to do stuff for free and for favours, and we've all been there. Is that going to be your point, Bayile? Is that exactly what you were going to say?
David, yes, I was just going to say, if the resources are there for each organisation or different organisations to deliver their service, and that way it supports, as Ellis said, like let's say it's a trans Black man, we'll just use with a disability. I know that I could only cover the Black aspect, but so you could give me resources for that, and then the signposting with the partnerships. But if there's only one pot of money for equality, we're all going to scramble for the same pot of money, and that man will not have the support that he really needs. And it won't actually foster those partnerships that should develop organically, but can't develop organically because there's only one small pot for that equality. And I think it's about recognizing that there are going to be intersectionalities. I think we saw that with the census. It didn't cross those intersectionalities. And it's about moving forward and actually, what are you going to take away from this session? What are you going to implement in your organization? Are you going to look under the hood of your bonnet for your organization?
Thanks, Bayile. I think the concept of intersectionality is something that's really interesting to start to explore in more detail, and what we've not been able to do in an introductory session. But I think you're getting a flavour for the complexity and how this all needs to be person-centred, and thinking about that in a really sensitive way. And that's perhaps something that we might explore in future sessions. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to move to my final question before we then move to the close of the event. I'm conscious of time and what everybody else has on today, but as I identified right at the start of the session, equality, diversity and inclusion has been identified as being a priority within the Social Enterprise Action Plan by the Scottish Government. So this is an opportunity for the speakers to feed directly back into that work. And if I could ask you, again, we'll go in the same order as we have done already in the session. What would your one piece of advice be, Bayile, then David, then Ellis, for the social enterprise officials within the Scottish Government as they think about this work going forward? What would your one suggestion or a piece of advice or strongly worded advice be as they think about taking this work forward? Bayile, you first of all.
I feel like a parrot because I say this on social media all the time. When it comes to ethnic minorities, we need the data. We need conclusive data before any support can be put forward. We've seen the Pathways report being released for female entrepreneurship, but even through the Pathways report, they realise that ethnic minorities do face further barriers. When are we going to see that report for ethnic minority entrepreneurs, and then see the same data coming out for ethnic minority social entrepreneurs? In the census, it just said 3%. We didn't know how many of that 3% was women, how many were men, and how many, whether they were also identified as other genders. So we need to see that data. We can't move on unless the data is released, and that's something that I'm hoping can be seen this year if possible.
Great, thank you. So that's data. That's point one to go back to Scottish Government on. David, from your point of view and disabled people, what would your piece of advice be?
Are we assuming there's no resources because there's never any money? So let's assume there's no resources. And so there's no point asking for that. How about trying to make sure that social enterprises do at least have knowledge and information about other things that government are funding anyway, perhaps, that could be of use and of value to them, whether it's in the local area or the national programs and things like that, and being able to make connections or facilitate connections in local communities and things like that. So for example, I don't know if you guys are looking for additional workers, but you obviously have got very limited money, but you've also got local colleges nearby that are looking for opportunities for young people that are needing work experiences or something in that. And then you've also got many local authorities that run intermediate labour market projects where positions are actually funded. SCVO have done a lot of this over the years, but we recently used a project in Eastern Bartonshire where the local authority paid the young person's wage to work with us, and we topped that up to living wage. So it gave that young person a great opportunity, and they moved on to a job as well. So the problem you guys will have will be the same problem we've got. You're a small organisation, you can't know about everything, you can't do everything yourself, and there's a whole full-time job just trying to keep on top of it all. So something that helps you guys link into perhaps what's already existing and what's already been funded, and make sure people have that information and advice.
Great. So that's broadly about joining up the dots and make sure nothing's missed. So we've got data and we've got joining up the dots. And then last but not least, Ellis, what would your piece of advice be to the Scottish Government?
Thanks. For me, it's about targeted support. So it's recognising that people that have different experiences have different needs, and it builds on the data point, but it's saying, okay, what is that targeted support? Is that we need to have a specific LGBT social entrepreneurs leadership program, which is one of the conversations we're having at the moment? Or is it saying actually it's about funding? Or is it saying it's about safety? Or is it saying it's about accessibility? But it's saying, okay, what is the specific targeted support that's needed? And recognizing that if you want to build a more diverse sector, you can't just work with the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's about more targeted support and intentionality around about what the plans are here. So about an hour and 20 minutes ago, we set out to say that we hoped that you would leave the session better informed and more knowledgeable about when you came in, and perhaps a little bit curious to go away and find out more about some of the things that you've heard about today. And I hope that we have achieved that. There are certain things that I've heard about that I'm going to go away and investigate in more detail. So I hope that you are the same. I just want to end very briefly with some thank yous. First of all, thank you to Social Enterprise Scotland for putting on this event. This is something, an agenda and a programme of activity that we're going to be exploring in more detail. I know that they're very keen to learn and reflect on what people are looking for in terms of continuing this journey. So I know that Kim and Jane and others in the team there will be delighted to hear from you if you've got further suggestions. So my thanks to them for having the confidence to put on this session. Secondly, my thanks go to all of you for giving up your time to attend. I think we have had a rich conversation, and I thank you for the attentive and respectful way in which you've approached the session, because that's really important. And thirdly, of course, my thanks go to the speakers who have given up some of their time over lunchtime, not only to be here, but actually to share what can often be some quite difficult and challenging lived experience. And it takes confidence to do that in a safe space. And I'm really grateful to David, Bayile and Ellis for coming along and doing that today. It really has meant a lot and added a real richness to the discussion. It's only from that lived experience are we able to learn more and learn in a really rich way. So a huge thank you from me for giving up the time to participate in the session today. So with 5 minutes to spare, I'll let you go and get the kettle on before the next meetings over the rest of the day. And a big thank you from me for coming along to today's session. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Bye now.